The November fog pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street like a living thing, transforming the familiar thoroughfare into a maze of amber gaslight and shifting shadows. Dr. Watson had been absorbed in the evening edition of the Times when the sharp rap of knuckles against their door echoed through the sitting room, followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps ascending the 17 steps. Inspector Lestrade appeared in their doorway, his usually confident bearing replaced by an expression of profound bewilderment. His bowler hat clutched tightly in his gloved hands. "Holmes, Watson," he began without preamble, his voice carrying an unusual tremor. "I find myself in need of your particular expertise. A most singular murder has occurred in Clerkenwell, one that has left my finest men utterly baffled." Sherlock Holmes, who had been examining a curious stain upon a piece of fabric through his magnifying glass, raised his aquiline head with the sharp attention of a complainsive hunting hawk. "Singular, Lestrade? Your vocabulary suggests something beyond the merely puzzling. Pray, elaborate." "Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, wife of Master Clockmaker Cornelius Whitmore of Seckford Street, was discovered dead in her husband's workshop this afternoon," Lestrade reported, consulting his notebook with obvious relief at having concrete facts to present. "Strangled, by all appearances. Yet the circumstances are utterly impossible." Watson set aside his newspaper, his medical instincts immediately engaged. "Strangled? Was the weapon recovered?" "That's precisely the difficulty, Doctor. No ligature was found, no cord, no scarf, nothing. The marks upon her throat suggest powerful hands, yet the workshop was locked from the inside. Mr. Whitmore had gone to deliver a repaired chronometer to a client in Mayfair. When he returned at 4:30, he found the door bolted from within. The single window was latched tight, its dust undisturbed. He was forced to break down the door to gain entry." Holmes had risen from his chair, his grey eyes now bright with that familiar gleam Watson knew so well. The victim's position when discovered. Seated at her husband's workbench, slumped forward as though she had simply fallen asleep over her embroidery. But here's the strangest detail of all. Every timepiece in the workshop had stopped at precisely 23 minutes past 2 o'clock. Pocket watches, mantel clocks, even the great regulator that Whitmore claims never varies by so much as a second, all frozen at the same moment. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Every clock stopped simultaneously. That seems rather beyond coincidence. "Indeed," Lestrade continued, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "The workshop apprentice, young Timothy Marsh, swears he left Mrs. Whitmore alive and well when he departed for his dinner at 2 o'clock precisely. He remembers checking the regulator, as he always does. When he returned an hour later, he found his master attempting to force the door. Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his long fingers steepled before his chest. The husband's whereabouts during the critical period, delivering that chronometer to Sir Reginald Ashford in Belgrave Square. The gentleman's butler confirms the appointment, and Whitmore took tea with Sir Reginald until nearly 4 o'clock. Multiple witnesses place him there throughout the afternoon. And the apprentice's movements? He dined at the Lamb and Flag public house on Lamb's Conduit Street. The proprietor remembers him well. Apparently the young man was celebrating some good news about an engagement to a local girl. Several patrons can vouch for his presence. Holmes paused at the window, pressing his palm against the fog-steamed glass. A locked room, a vanished killer, and time itself brought to a standstill. Most intriguing indeed. He turned, and Watson recognized that particular intensity that marked the beginning of one of his friend's most challenging cases. The game, as they say, is afoot. "Lestrade, I trust your constables have not trampled too enthusiastically through this theatrical scene. I gave strict orders that nothing be disturbed, knowing you would wish to examine everything personally." Holmes reached for his coat and deerstalker hat. "Excellent. Watson, your medical bag, if you please. We shall venture into Clerkenwell before this fog grows thicker and perhaps discover how a murderer managed to stop time itself." The hansom cab rattled through the fog-shrouded streets toward Clerkenwell, its wheels striking the damp cobblestones with rhythmic precision that seemed to mock the silence, awaiting us at our destination. Holmes sat forward with barely contained energy, his aquiline profile occasionally illuminated by the amber glow of passing street lamps, while his keen eyes remained fixed on some invisible point beyond the swirling mist. The air grew thicker as we descended into the narrow streets of the clockmaking district, heavy with the industrial scents of coal, smoke, and metal polish that characterized this corner of London's artisan quarter. "Tell me, Lestrade," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the clip-clop of hooves. "What manner of woman was Mrs. Whitmore? Her habits, her daily routine?" "By all accounts, a devoted wife of some 38 years," Lestrade replied, consulting his notebook by the dim interior light. "Childless, which seemed to cause her considerable melancholy according to the neighbors. She spent most afternoons in her husband's workshop, doing needlework while he worked, reserved by nature, though never unfriendly to those who knew her." Watson leaned forward with professional interest. "Any suggestion of discord in the marriage? Financial difficulties?" "None whatsoever, Doctor. Whitmore's business thrives, he maintains, timepieces for several prominent households, and recently secured a contract with the Royal Observatory. Mrs. Whitmore rarely ventured beyond the immediate neighborhood, and then only for essential errands." The cab lurched to a halt before a narrow three-story building wedged between a haberdashery and a small tavern. The ground floor window displayed C. Whitmore, Master Clockmaker, in elegant script, though the interior lay shrouded in darkness. A constable stood guard beside the entrance, nodding respectfully as we alighted into the chill November air. Holmes examined the doorframe with his magnifying glass before entering, running his fingers along the wood grain and paying particular attention to the lock mechanism. "No signs of forced entry from the outside," he murmured. "The wood splinters inward where your men broke through. But observe the bolt has been recently greased. Note the linear residue, as from a slender applicator." The workshop's interior revealed itself as Lestrade lit the gas jets. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces crowded with delicate tools and partially assembled timepieces that gleamed like golden serpents in the flickering light. The air held the mingled scents of machine oil, metal polish, and something else, the faint, unmistakable trace of recent death. But it was the clocks that commanded immediate attention. Dozens of them, from grand regulators to delicate pocket watches, all frozen at 23 minutes past 2 o'clock, their silent faces creating an eerie chorus of arrested time. Mrs. Whitmore's body had been removed, but chalk outlines marked her final position at the central workbench. Her embroidery hoop lay nearby, its half-completed garden scene displaying remarkable skill. Holmes moved with predatory grace, beginning a methodical circuit of the room rather than immediately examining the obvious evidence. I knelt beside the chalk outline, my medical training engaged. The position suggested she had simply slumped forward, as if overcome by sudden fatigue. Yet Lestrade's description of the throat markings troubled me. Strangulation without conventional ligature marks was highly unusual. "Watson," Holmes called softly from near the great regulator. "Observe this." He held a tiny translucent globule on the tip of his knife blade. "Wax, and recently deposited. Most curious in a workshop where such substances serve specific purposes." He continued his examination, lifting a pocket watch and listening intently. "Fully wound," he announced. "All of them. Fully wound, yet silent, not merely stopped by coincidence, but halted with deliberate precision." At that moment, Lestrade ushered in a small, precise man whose grief had worn him like a physical burden. Cornelius Whitmore was perhaps 55, with the steady hands and keen eyes of a master craftsman, though both now trembled with shock. "My wife," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She would sit here each afternoon, sewing while I worked in the back room with clients. I left at precisely 1:41 to deliver Sir Reginald's chronometer, returned after 4 to find." His voice broke. Holmes regarded him with unexpected gentleness. "Your regulator. Mr. Whitmore, it is your pride. My life's work. It has never varied by more than a second in 15 years. Yet today, it stopped with all the others." Whitmore's face crumpled. "I cannot account for it, Mr. Holmes. I would sooner believe my own heart had ceased beating." Holmes's gaze fell upon something beneath the workbench, a small pair of embroidery scissors attached to a length of blue silk ribbon that appeared shorter than filth. Practical convenience would dictate. He measured it against his forearm with seeming casualness, then straightened. "Lestrade," he said quietly, "I should like this room sealed exactly as found. No one is to wind or adjust a single timepiece until I give permission." As we prepared to leave, Holmes drew me aside. "Watson," he murmured, "observe what is absent from this scene of apparent perfection." I looked about helplessly at the orderly workshop. "Everything appears to be present, Holmes." "Precisely," he replied with the ghost of a smile. "And therein lies our first real clue." Holmes's enigmatic observation about absence speaking louder than presence lingered in the workshop's peculiar silence as he moved with renewed purpose toward the central workbench. The fog pressed against the windows like curious spectators, while the frozen timepieces seemed to watch our every movement with their motionless hands. I observed my friend's methodical approach, knowing that each seemingly casual glance represented a calculated assessment of evidence invisible to ordinary eyes. "Watson," he said, lifting a shallow wooden drawer labeled silks and threads from beneath the workbench, "observe the dust pattern here." The drawer contained several cards, wound with various colored threads, but one blue card lay conspicuously empty, its surface bearing the clear outline of a recently removed bobbin. "Mrs. Whitmore was indeed working with blue silk this afternoon, yet where has it gone?" Before I could venture a response, Holmes had moved to examine the embroidery scissors more closely. The blue ribbon that secured them to the workbasket appeared freshly cut, leaving barely enough length to keep the scissors tethered. These scissors, Watson, would normally hang at waist level when worn about the neck, a common practice among seamstresses. Yet, someone has shortened this ribbon by precisely 18 inches. The cut is clean, deliberate, and recent. He knelt beside the great regulator, his magnifying glass revealing a thin smear of wax upon the wooden base. Beeswax, not the mineral wax typically used in clockwork maintenance. Most curious. Rising, he traced an almost invisible line in the dust beneath the workbench with his finger. A thread was drawn here, Watson, something fine enough to leave only the faintest disturbance in the accumulated dust. At that moment, the workshop door opened to admit a young man whose nervous energy was barely contained beneath a veneer of respectful deference. Timothy Marsh appeared no more than 20, with the ink-stained fingers and slightly stooped shoulders common to those who spent their days hunched over delicate mechanisms. His face bore the pallor of shock, though his eyes remained alert and intelligent. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Inspector Lestrade said you might wish to speak with me about this afternoon's events. I've told him everything I remember, but if there's anything more I can do to help find who did this terrible thing to poor Mrs. Whitmore." "Indeed, Mr. Marsh, your routine upon leaving for dinner, you mentioned checking the regulator." "Whitmore insists upon absolute punctuality. Time is our trade, he always says, and we must be its most faithful servants. I've checked that clock every day for 3 years, at precisely 2 o'clock when I leave for my meal." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "And today it showed the correct time when you departed?" "To the very second, sir." Mrs. Whitmore even remarked upon my punctuality as I gathered my coat. She was working on her embroidery forget-me-nots for the church bazaar and seemed in unusually good spirits. "Unusually good spirits? Pray elaborate, Mr. Marsh." The young man shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Holmes and Lestrade. "Well, sir, Mrs. Whitmore was generally a melancholy sort of lady, what with having no children and keeping mostly to herself. But today, she seemed almost hopeful, if I may say so. She mentioned receiving some pleasant news in the Morning Post, though she didn't say what it concerned. Said it was a small matter that might grow into something wonderful. This detail struck me as potentially significant, and I noticed Holmes file it away with that particular intensity he reserved for crucial information. The morning correspondence, did you observe any letters upon her personal workbench? No, sir. Mrs. Whitmore always kept her personal letters in the small mahogany box on the mantelpiece upstairs. Very particular about her privacy, she was. Most illuminating. Now, Mr. Marsh, I understand congratulations are in order regarding your engagement. The apprentice's face brightened, despite the somber circumstances. Yes, sir. Thank you. Miss Sarah Fletcher, her father, owns the bakery on Gray's Inn Road. We've been walking out for nearly 2 years, and he finally gave his consent yesterday evening. I was rather excited about sharing the news, I'm afraid. Perfectly natural. During your celebration at the Lamb and Flag, did you encounter anyone who knew of your connection to this workshop? Timothy considered carefully. Several of the regular patrons know where I work. Certainly. And I may have mentioned it to some of the others. I was in such high spirits about the engagement. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then produced the empty silk card. This blue thread was Mrs. Whitmore working with this particular shade. Oh yes, sir. She was quite particular about matching the exact color of forget-me-nots. Said the church ladies would notice if it wasn't precisely right. One final question, Mr. Marsh. When you returned from dinner, was Mr. Whitmore already attempting to force the door? Yes, sir. He seemed quite distressed, calling out to his wife and throwing his shoulder against the wood. I offered to help, but he was already through by the time I reached him. The sight that greeted us. The young man's voice trailed off, and he shuddered visibly. As Lestrade prepared to escort Timothy away, Holmes drew me aside once more. Watson, we are witnessing the work of a mind that understands both the mechanical and the psychological aspects of deception. The stopped clocks, the locked room. These are not mere coincidences but carefully orchestrated elements designed to create a specific impression. He moved to the window, examining the latch mechanism with his glass. Recently lubricated with graphite, he murmured, yet the dust on the sill remains undisturbed. Someone wanted this window to open and close silently, though they ultimately chose not to use it as an exit. The fog continued to swirl outside, transforming familiar London into a maze of shadows and amber light. As we prepared to examine the Whitmores' private quarters above the workshop, Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen gaze sweeping the scene one final time. The truth, Watson, lies not in the grand gestures of stopped time and locked doors, but in the small details, a shortened ribbon, a missing bobbin of thread, a widow's unexpected joy on the morning of her death. Tomorrow we shall piece together how these fragments form a picture of murder most ingeniously conceived. The narrow staircase leading to the Whitmores' private quarters creaked beneath our feet as we ascended, leaving behind the eerie silence of the workshop with its frozen timepieces. The upper floor revealed itself as a testament to modest prosperity and careful domesticity. Antimacassars adorned every chair, while photographs of deceased relatives gazed down from their silver frames with Victorian solemnity. The sitting room bore the unmistakable stamp of a woman's touch. From the carefully arranged dried flowers to the precisely positioned cushions that spoke of hours spent in quiet contemplation. Holmes moved immediately to the mahogany correspondence box Timothy had mentioned, his long fingers examining the brass lock with professional interest. Inside, the box contained several letters tied with faded ribbon, but Holmes's attention fixed upon 2 items that lay separate from the others. The first bore the embossed letterhead of Hartwell, Pemberton and Associates, solicitors of Lincoln's Inn, while the second carried the elegant script of the Ladies' Benevolent Society. Most illuminating, Watson, he said, unfolding the solicitor's letter. Adelaide Whitmore was informed yesterday that she had inherited the sum of £3,000 from a recently deceased great-aunt in Yorkshire. The inheritance was to be finalised within the fortnight. He set that correspondence aside and lifted the second letter. And here we find mention of an infant girl of respectable parentage, now grown to schooling age, and a proposed interview regarding adoption proceedings. Two pieces of extraordinarily good news arriving simultaneously enough to lift any woman's spirits considerably. I felt the pieces beginning to form a pattern. £3,000 would represent a fortune to most people in Clerkenwell. Combined with the prospect of finally having a child, it would indeed explain her unusual happiness. But it also provides motives for murder. Indeed, Holmes murmured, but his attention had already shifted to examining the room itself. Near the window, he knelt beside a small sewing basket, noting the same absence we had discovered below. The missing blue silk, Watson, is not here either. Nor do I find the remaining length of ribbon from those embroidery scissors. He moved to the mantelpiece, where a brass candlestick held a partially burned taper. Observe this candle. A narrow channel runs down one side, and upon the brass holder lies the faintest trace of blue fibre. Rising, he produced a length of ordinary thread from the sewing basket and demonstrated his theory with methodical precision. Silk thread, Watson, drawn taut across a candle flame and secured to a light mechanism, such as a well-oiled door bolt. Heat gnaws patiently at what steel cannot sever in silence. He positioned the thread so it stretched from the candle to the door frame. A gentle pull sets the arrangement. The flame provides the timing. When the silk burns through, the bolt slides home under its own weight. The demonstration was compelling, yet questions remained. But Holmes, how does this explain the stopped clocks? And how did the murderer escape the locked room? Patience, Watson. The clocks suggest a mind that understands both mechanical precision and psychological misdirection. As for escape, he moved to examine the window latch, his magnifying glass revealing recent lubrication. Prepared for use, but ultimately unnecessary. Our murderer had multiple contingencies. At that moment, footsteps on the stairs announced Lestrade's return, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger whose agitated bearing suggested considerable distress. The man appeared to be in his 40s, with the refined features of education and breeding, though his current demeanor spoke of barely controlled anxiety. "Holmes," Lestrade announced, "this gentleman has been asking after the Whitmores at several shops along the street. Says he's family. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Mrs. Whitmore's cousin." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, his eyes darting between the correspondence in Holmes's hands and the grieving widower who had followed us upstairs. "Mr. Holmes, thank Providence you're here. I've just learned of Adelaide's death, and I fear there are complications you must understand. She contacted me last week regarding the inheritance. There were certain family matters she wished to discuss privately, arrangements that now—" His voice trailed off as he struggled with his composure. "Dr. Hartwell," Holmes said gently, "what manner of arrangements?" Adelaide had discovered some irregularities in the inheritance documentation. She suspected someone else knew of the legacy and might attempt to claim it through fraudulent means. She asked me to verify certain legal details, and we had arranged to meet tomorrow to discuss her concerns. Whitmore stared in bewilderment. She said nothing of this to me, nothing of suspicions or concerns. Holmes studied the newcomer with that penetrating gaze I knew so well. "Dr. Hartwell, when did you last see your cousin?" "Not for several years, I'm ashamed to say. Family disagreements, you understand. But her letter last week was urgent. She feared for her safety and wanted legal counsel she could trust." "And yet," Holmes observed mildly, "she shared none of these fears with her husband, nor mentioned any family complications to her apprentice, who noted only her unusually good spirits." A flush crept up Dr. Hartwell's neck. Adelaide was always cautious about raising false hopes. She may have preferred to resolve the matter quietly before involving Cornelius. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved to the wardrobe, which stood slightly ajar. A quick examination revealed subtle signs of disturbance, clothing carefully replaced, but not quite in its original positions. Behind the hanging garments, he discovered a loose board concealing a small cavity, now empty, but bearing the rectangular impression of something recently removed. It appears, Dr. Hartwell, that someone has already conducted their own search of these premises. The question remains whether they found what they sought. Holmes turned back to the correspondence box, his expression growing more grave. Watson, we are dealing with a mind that operates on multiple levels. The technical precision of the locked room, the psychological manipulation of timing and motive, and now the introduction of inheritance complications that may or may not be genuine. As the fog continued to swirl outside the windows, transforming familiar London into a maze of shadows and uncertainty, Holmes gathered the letters and moved toward the stair. Gentlemen, I believe it is time we paid a visit to the Lamb and Flag. If young Timothy's celebration was as public as he suggested, someone may have overheard details that proved useful to our murderer. The stopped clocks, the locked door, the missing inheritance documents, each element has been carefully orchestrated, but even the most meticulous criminal leaves traces for those who know how to look. The case had grown considerably more complex, with motives multiplying even as the technical mystery of the murder method began to yield its secrets. Yet I sensed that Holmes, despite his calm demeanor, was troubled by something he had not yet shared. Some detail that suggested the true depth of the deception we faced. The Lamb and Flag stood like a beacon against the November chill, its amber windows cutting through the thickening fog as we made our way along Lamb's Conduit Street. The public house bore the comfortable shabbiness of an establishment that had served working men for generations, its low-beamed interior thick with pipe smoke and the mingled aromas of ale, tobacco, and hearty fare. Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen eyes surveying the evening crowd with that peculiar intensity he reserved for environments where secrets might be carelessly revealed. The proprietor, a robust man with graying whiskers named Pritchard, recognized our purpose immediately when Lestrade made introductions. Aye, young Timothy was here earlier, celebrating his engagement to the Fletcher girl, he confirmed, wiping his hands on a stained apron. Bought around for half the room, bless him, though he could ill afford such generosity on an apprentice's wages. In fine spirits, he was, telling anyone who'd listen about his good fortune. Holmes positioned himself where Timothy had sat, his magnifying glass revealing a faint smear upon the wooden table. Beeswax, he murmured, lifting a tiny globule with his knife blade. And observe this blue discoloration. Watson the same. Shade we discovered in the workshop. He examined the brass footrail beneath the table, finding similar traces embedded in the metal's crevices. This celebration, Holmes continued, addressing Pritchard, was it well attended? Did Mr. Marsh speak freely of his circumstances? Oh, he was in fine fettle, Mr. Holmes. Talked about his Sarah, about his work at Whitmore's shop. Even mentioned how pleased Mrs. Whitmore had seemed that very afternoon. Said she'd received some wonderful news in the Morning Post, an inheritance from family up north, he claimed. £3,000, if memory serves. A grizzled patron near the fire looked up from his contemplation. That young fellow's celebration drew some attention, if you take my meaning. Perhaps an hour after he left, another gentleman came asking casual questions about who'd been celebrating and what news they might have shared. Holmes's expression sharpened with interest. Describe this gentleman, if you please. Well-dressed, but not ostentatious, middle-aged, with the bearing of a professional man. Had intelligent eyes that seemed to take in more than they revealed. Ordered a whiskey but barely touched it, just sat there listening to conversations around him. When he'd learned what he came for, he made his excuses and departed rather abruptly. The potboy, eager to contribute, added, "Beggin' pardon, sir, but the gentleman's coat showed tiny specks when the light caught it like metal dust, and he wore gloves, though the evening wasn't particularly cold." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved to examine the settle where this mysterious inquirer had sat. His glass revealed minute particles embedded in the wooden arm metallic filings that glinted in the gaslight. "Most illuminating," he said, carefully collecting samples in his evidence envelope. Pritchard continued. The gentleman seemed particularly interested when conversation turned to the inheritance. Asked whether young Timothy worked regular hours and if the workshop kept busy throughout the day. Struck me as odd questions for casual curiosity. "Did he arrive alone?" Holmes inquired. Hansom cab waited outside. I noticed because the driver seemed impatient, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. When the gentleman emerged, I heard him give an address, though I couldn't make out the specific street. As we prepared to leave the warmth of the public house, Holmes drew me aside with an expression of growing concern. "Watson, observe how methodically our adversary has gathered intelligence. First, he learns of the inheritance and Mrs. Whitmore's routine through Timothy's innocent celebration. Then he acquires the necessary materials, silk thread, beeswax, ribbon from the haberdashery. Finally, he executes a murder so technically sophisticated that it appears impossible. The fog seemed to press closer as we stepped outside, transforming familiar London into a maze of shadows and muffled sounds." Holmes continued, his voice barely audible above the clip-clop of passing horses. The stopped clocks, the locked room, the missing documents. Each element serves a specific purpose in a larger deception. But I fear we are dealing with someone who possesses both technical expertise and intimate knowledge of the Whitmore's circumstances. Lestrade rejoined us, stamping his feet against the cold. "What's our next move, Holmes?" "Tomorrow we shall visit Sir Reginald Ashford in Belgrave Square," Holmes replied, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. "If Whitmore's alibi is as solid as it appears, we must examine why someone wanted us to believe it unshakable. Sometimes, Watson, the most convincing evidence is precisely what we should trust least." As our hansom cab carried us back through the fog-wrapped streets toward Baker Street, I sensed that Holmes had begun to perceive the true scope of the conspiracy we faced. The case had evolved beyond a simple locked-room murder into something far more sinister. A web of deception that threatened to ensnare not only the innocent, but perhaps ourselves as well. The morning had brought little relief from the November fog as our hansom cab navigated the broad, elegant avenues of Belgrave Square, where the grand Georgian terraces stood like monuments to aristocratic permanence amid the swirling mist. The contrast between these opulent residences and the modest workshops of Clerkenwell could not have been more pronounced. Yet Holmes's keen eyes remained fixed on the imposing facade of Sir Reginald Ashford's mansion with the same intensity he had shown in examining the humblest evidence. Sir Reginald received us in his library, a magnificent room that spoke of both wealth and genuine scholarly pursuits. The walls bore portraits of distinguished ancestors, while countless timepieces ticked softly from every available surface, creating a gentle symphony of mechanical precision. Our host proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 70 years, with the bearing of one accustomed to authority and the sharp eyes of a man who had built his fortune through careful attention to detail. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Sir Reginald began, settling into his leather chair with the careful movements of advanced age. "Inspector Lestrade's message suggested you wished to discuss yesterday's unfortunate events. I can hardly believe poor Mrs. Whitmore is dead, such a gentle soul, though I knew her only through her husband's work." Holmes positioned himself where he could observe both our host's expressions and the magnificent collection of timepieces. "Your appointment with Mr. Whitmore yesterday, might you describe the circumstances in detail?" "Certainly. Cornelius arrived at precisely 2 minutes before 2 o'clock. I know because my butler had just set the drawing-room clock by the Greenwich time signal. He brought my grandfather's marine, chronometer, which had required delicate adjustment to its escapement mechanism. We spent considerable time discussing the intricacies of the repair, then took tea until nearly 4 o'clock. Whitmore's demeanor during this visit? Quite animated, actually. More so than usual. He mentioned that his wife had received some pleasant news that morning, seemed genuinely happy for her, though he didn't elaborate on the specifics. Holmes moved to examine a magnificent grandfather clock in the corner, then produced his pocket watch for comparison. Sir Reginald, yesterday afternoon, did you notice any peculiarities with your timepieces? Our host's eyebrows rose with interest. How extraordinary that you should ask. The drawing-room chiming clock arrested itself at precisely 23 minutes past 2. Most peculiar, as I had only just set it. Mr. Whitmore was kind enough to examine it, called it a stubborn speck in the escapement, and had it running, again, within minutes. Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with unmistakable interest. The same moment the workshop clock stopped, he murmured, then requested to examine the chronometer itself. Sir Reginald produced the instrument from its velvet-lined case, and Holmes turned it over with expert care, uncasing the movement with delicate precision. Most interesting, he said softly, lifting a tiny, translucent globule on his knife blade. Beeswax, recently deposited near the mechanism housing. He paused, extracting an almost invisible filament from the crown's knurling, and blue silk thread so fine as to be nearly imperceptible. Is that significant, Mr. Holmes? Everything is significant, Holmes replied mildly, though not everything is decisive. He reassembled the chronometer with practiced efficiency, then turned to the butler who had appeared at the doorway. You can confirm Mr. Whitmore remained within the house throughout his visit? Absolutely, sir. I saw him arrive and depart myself. The cab waited at the gate. I instructed the driver to return at 4 o'clock precisely. As we prepared to leave, Holmes drew me aside in the elegant hallway. Watson, observe how perfectly each element aligns. At the precise moment the workshop timepieces stopped, a clock here in Belgrave Square elected to do likewise. Either we credit an epidemic among escapements, or we accept deliberate design. You believe the murder was accomplished through some timed mechanism? I believe we contend with a mind that measures not merely seconds, but human credulity itself. Holmes replied. A time candle with prepared channels can release catches at predetermined moments. Silk threads and beeswax anchors, properly arranged, can slide bolts, arrest pendulums, and if we are dealing with true wickedness, tighten a prepared ligature around an unsuspecting throat. At that moment, a boy in buttons came racing across the square, waving a bairn, telegram like a battle standard. Mr. Holmes, sir, from Lincoln's Inn. Holmes broke the seal and scanned the message, his composed features taking on a ferocity I had learned to associate with danger at close quarters. Watson, the solicitors Hartwell, Pemberton and Associates suffered a burglary during the night. The only file disturbed concerned the late Miss Millicent Warburton of Yorkshire and her prospective bequest to Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore. They request our immediate assistance. As our cab rolled eastward through the fog-wrapped streets, Holmes's fingers tapped a silent rhythm upon his knee. The convergence grows too precise to discount design, Watson. A letter promising fortune, a household clock stopped at the identical moment as a workshop full of them, and now a burglary that strips a legacy of its documentary foundation. Someone has been orchestrating these events with clockwork precision, and before nightfall, I intend to discover who has been winding the mechanism of our investigation. The offices of Hartwell, Pemberton and Associates occupied a distinguished Georgian building within Lincoln's Inn, its dignified facade now marred by the presence of constables and the unmistakable atmosphere of violation that accompanies criminal intrusion. The November fog had lifted slightly, allowing pale sunlight to illuminate the scene of methodical destruction that awaited us in the senior partner's chambers. Mr. Pemberton himself, a gentleman of considerable years whose normally precise demeanor had been shattered by the night's events, gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding his mahogany desk. Mr. "Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice trembling with a mixture of indignation and bewilderment. "In 40 years of legal practice, I have never witnessed such precise criminality. The burglar ignored our safe, which contains documents worth thousands of pounds, and concentrated entirely upon one specific client file. Every paper relating to the Whodunit estate has been systematically removed. Holmes moved through the violated office with that predatory grace I had come to recognize, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. The window latch showed signs of expert manipulation, while the scattered documents bore the hallmarks of theatrical arrangement rather than genuine ransacking. "The method of entry suggests considerable skill," he observed, examining minute scratches upon the brass lock mechanism. "Note the precision of these tool marks. Watson, the work of an instrument maker, rather than a common cracksman. Most disturbing, Mr. Holmes," Pemberton continued, "is that whoever accomplished this knew exactly what they sought and where to find it. But there are complications regarding the inheritance that we had not yet communicated to Mrs. Whitmore." The solicitor consulted his remaining notes with obvious reluctance. Miss Warburton's will contained a peculiar clause, requiring the inheritance to be claimed in person by both Mrs. Whitmore and her husband, with proper identification and marriage certificates presented to our offices within 30 days of notification. This revelation struck me with considerable force. Then both parties were required to appear together? Precisely, Dr. Watson. Miss Warburton had grown suspicious of inheritance fraud in her final years and insisted upon elaborate verification procedures. Without both parties present and properly documented, the £3,000 would revert to the Yorkshire Orphans Charitable Trust. Holmes paused in his examination of the filing cabinet, his grey eyes sharpening with unmistakable interest. "Then, Mrs. Whitmore's death effectively nullifies the bequest entirely?" "Indeed. The inheritance now passes to charity, as specified in the alternative provisions." From the drawer's interior, Holmes extracted an almost invisible fibre with his knife blade. "Blue silk," he murmured, and here, pressed into the metal runner, traces of beeswax, where his graphite stick revealed the ghostly impressions of previous writing, fragments of words including beneficiary and the partial initials A.W. beneath the word consent. At that moment, the night porter was summoned, a raw-boned fellow who twisted his cap nervously as he spoke. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I did see a gentleman in the corridor shortly after midnight. Said he was Mr. Pemberton's medical advisor, called to attend a sudden turn. Had a letter with the firm's seal, so I didn't question him. Seemed respectable, though his coat showed tiny bright specks when the light caught it, and he wore fine gloves despite the mild weather. The scent of machine oil, rather than a sick room," Holmes added thoughtfully. "And these metallic filings embedded in the window putty suggest our visitor prepared his exit as carefully as his entrance." Holmes straightened, his expression growing more grave. "Gentlemen, we are witnessing the work of a mind that operates on multiple levels. Someone learned of the inheritance through Timothy's celebration, discovered the dual signature requirement through careful inquiry, then eliminated Mrs. Whitmore to prevent any legitimate claim. The burglary serves not to steal the inheritance, but to erase all evidence that it ever existed." "But Holmes," I protested, "if her death nullifies the inheritance entirely, what purpose does the murder serve?" "Ah, Watson. That assumes our adversary's goal was financial gain. Consider instead that someone required Mrs. Whitmore's death for reasons unrelated to the inheritance itself, and used the legacy as misdirection to obscure their true motive." As we prepared to leave Lincoln's Inn, the fog began to thicken once more, and I sensed that Holmes's methodical investigation was about to transform into something far more dangerous. Case had evolved beyond murder into active conspiracy, and somewhere in the maze of London's streets, a killer was moving to eliminate the remaining witnesses to his carefully orchestrated deception. The revelation that the inheritance served as elaborate misdirection rather than genuine motive cast our investigation in an entirely new light as we departed Lincoln's Inn through the thickening November fog. Holmes maintained a contemplative silence during our journey, his aquiline features set in that expression of intense concentration I had learned to associate with the final stages of his deductive process. The mechanical precision with which our adversary had orchestrated each element, the stopped clocks, the locked room, the burgled solicitor's office, spoke of a mind that operated on multiple levels of deception, using the promise of £3,000 to obscure motives far more personal and dangerous. Our next destination proved to be the Ladies' Benevolent Society in Bloomsbury, where the adoption arrangements had been made. The organization occupied a sober brick building whose brass nameplate gleamed with ministerial authority, and within its austere parlor we were received by Miss Prouse, a tall woman whose iron-grey hair and severe demeanor suggested decades of managing charitable works with ecclesiastical precision. Her ledger, ruled with draftsman-like accuracy, confirmed Mrs. Whitmore's appointment for the following Tuesday to discuss adopting an 8-year-old girl of excellent parentage. "She wrote to me yesterday morning," Miss Prouse explained, her stern features softening almost imperceptibly, requesting the earliest possible interview. There was something touching about her mention of forget-me-nots, perhaps a foolish sentiment, but it moved me considerably. Holmes examined the parlor with his characteristic thoroughness, his magnifying glass revealing traces of graphite upon the door latch and a small bead of wax upon the hinge screw. When we moved to inspect the records room, his keen senses detected the faint tang of paraffin mixed with beeswax, leading him to discover a partially burned, slow-match arrangement beneath a candlestick. "Your records were to be consumed by fire within minutes of our departure," he announced grimly, extinguishing the smoldering device. Our adversary rehearses his destruction with the same precision he applies to murder. From the filing cabinet, Holmes extracted the adoption file, which contained a pressed sprig of forget-me-not and a visiting card bearing the prospective child's information. His grey eyes flickered with unmistakable recognition as he examined the documents, though he quickly sealed the folder for safekeeping. "Watson," he said as we prepared to leave, "observe the pattern emerging. A medical advisor at Lincoln's Inn, with metallic dust on his coat. Dr. Edmund Hartwell appearing as a convenient cousin. The well-dressed gentleman making inquiries at the Lamb and Flag, all bearing the same distinctive characteristics. We are dealing with someone who possesses both medical knowledge and the precise skills of an instrument maker, someone capable of fashioning devices to stop clocks and tighten ligatures with silent efficiency." At that moment, Lestrade appeared through the fog, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. "Holmes, young Marsh has been attacked, found half-strangled in a mews off Gray's Inn Road. He's alive but barely conscious. Claims he was summoned by a note bearing your handwriting." The implication struck me with chilling force. "A forgery?" "Expertly crafted," Lestrade confirmed. "The lad says his attacker wore gloves and smelled of machine oil with tiny bright specks on his coat. Silk ligature, by the marks on his throat, drawn tight, then released when footsteps approached." Holmes's expression grew fierce with controlled anger. "He is eliminating witnesses, systematically. Watson. Anyone who might connect him to the crime or expose his true identity." Timothy heard Mrs. Whitmore speak of her good news and repeated it publicly, making him a liability to be removed. As we returned to Baker Street through the fog-wrapped streets, Holmes's manner became increasingly restless. "Our adversary has overplayed his hand by threatening innocence," he declared, his voice carrying that dangerous edge I had learned to recognize. "Tomorrow we shall wind the clock for him and force him to strike before he is ready. The game, Watson, approaches its final movement, and I intend to ensure our mechanical murderer discovers that even the most precise timepiece can be made to run backward." The fog had scarcely lifted when Holmes set to work in our sitting room with methodical precision, spreading his collected evidence across the Persian rug like a surgeon preparing his instruments. The metallic filings from Lincoln's Inn and the lamb and flag glittered under his magnifying glass as he subjected them to chemical analysis, heating fragments in a silver spoon until they revealed their secrets. Nickel and steel in precise proportions. Watson, he announced with satisfaction. The distinctive composition of chronometer escapement teeth. Note also the lingering scent machine oil masked by wintergreen liniment. Our adversary disguises his workshop beneath the guise of a medical practice. Before I could fully absorb these revelations, Mrs. Hudson announced Cornelius Whitmore, whose grief-stricken appearance had been compounded by obvious bewilderment and growing fear. The clockmaker's usually steady hands trembled as he produced a leather portfolio from beneath his coat. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've discovered correspondence hidden in Adelaide's effects letters from someone claiming to be her cousin Edmund, discussing family matters she never mentioned to me. But observe the handwriting." He spread several documents across Holmes's chemical apparatus. "It matches receipts in my workshop, signed by clients I've never actually met." Holmes examined the forgeries with his glass, his expression growing increasingly grave. "The same hand that lured Timothy into danger. What else have you found, Mr. Whitmore?" "Adelaide kept a diary," Whitmore continued, producing a small journal bound in blue leather. "Brief entries, mostly, but she mentions receiving visits from cousin Edmund when I was away on business. He convinced her to reveal our financial circumstances, our daily routines, even the mechanical arrangements of my workshop locks." The diary's final entries proved particularly illuminating. Holmes read aloud, "Mrs. Whitmore's words from the morning of her death. Edmund says the inheritance papers require special handling, and he will call this afternoon to ensure everything is properly arranged. I must remember to have the blue silk ready for the church embroidery." Holmes closed the journal with deliberate care. "Watson, our murderer has been orchestrating this deception for months, gaining Mrs. Whitmore's complete trust while positioning himself to eliminate her at the precise moment her inheritance would be confirmed. But why such elaborate preparation for £3,000? I asked. "Because the inheritance was never his true objective," Holmes replied, moving to his desk where he had arranged the adoption file from the Ladies' Benevolent Society. "Observe this pressed sprig of forget-me-not within the documents, Watson, and this visiting card bearing details of the prospective child. Our adversary's motive is deeply personal, rooted in a connection to Mrs. Whitmore, and this adoption that he cannot permit to be exposed." Holmes dispatched Lestrade with specific instructions, a notice for the evening edition requesting any parties with knowledge of Mrs. Whitmore's recent correspondence regarding adoption proceedings to contact Sherlock Holmes before midnight and discreet surveillance of the workshop. "This notice will compel our murderer to act, Watson. He believes he has eliminated all traces of his connection to Mrs. Whitmore and this child. But the adoption file represents a direct threat evidence that could expose truths he deems too damaging to reveal." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Holmes prepared his trap with clockwork precision. At Whitmore's workshop, he restored motion to selected timepieces, their gentle ticking creating an atmosphere of deceptive normalcy. From his pocket he produced a coil of dark wire connected to a small bell, concealing the device beneath the central workbench. A prepared candle with scored channels was positioned where the intruder would find it, its blue silk thread arranged to slide the door bolt when the flame consumed the fiber. "We reproduce his theater, Watson," Holmes said softly as we took our positions in the shadowed workshop. "But tonight, our curtain falls upon the actor, not the audience. He will come, his fear of exposure demands it. And when he does, he will discover that even the most precisely wound mechanism can be made to run in reverse, revealing the true face of the clockmaker behind these crimes." The fog pressed against the windows, like curious spectators, as we waited in the mechanical silence, knowing that somewhere in London's maze of streets, a killer was moving toward his final, fatal appointment with justice. The workshop's restored timepieces marked the passing hours with their gentle symphony, each tick echoing through the fog-wrapped silence like a countdown to justice. Holmes and I waited in the shadows behind the great regulator, our breathing synchronized with the mechanical rhythms that surrounded us, while Lestrade positioned himself near the rear entrance. The amber glow of distant street lamps created shifting patterns through the misted windows, transforming familiar objects into potential allies in our carefully orchestrated trap. Near midnight, the soft scrape of metal against the front door's lock announced our quarry's arrival. Holmes's concealed wire trembled as footsteps crossed the threshold, and through the darkness we observed a figure moving with practiced stealth toward the central workbench. The intruder bore the refined bearing of professional respectability, yet his movements carried the fluid precision of one accustomed to delicate mechanical work. In the dim gaslight, I could discern the telltale specks of metal dust upon his dark coat and the surgical gloves that concealed his hands. The figure examined Holmes's prepared candle arrangement with obvious satisfaction, recognizing the blue silk thread drawn taut between flame and door mechanism. But as he bent to light the taper, Holmes stepped from the shadows with predatory grace. "Dr. Edmund Hartwell," Holmes announced, his voice cutting through the mechanical silence. "Though I suspect that name, like so many others you have worn, conceals a more complex identity." His refined features now visible in the flickering light. He appeared younger than his supposed medical credentials would suggest, with the steady hands of both surgeon and instrument maker. "Mr. Holmes," he said calmly, his cultured voice betraying no surprise, "your reputation for theatrical revelation precedes you, though I fear your conclusions rest upon mere supposition." "Supposition?" Holmes replied, producing the adoption file from his coat. "Then let us examine the evidence methodically. You are indeed a physician, but also a skilled craftsman who once worked as an instrument maker before scandal forced you to reinvent yourself. The metallic filings embedded in your clothing, the scent of wintergreen masking machine oil, the surgical precision of your forgeries, all point to this dual expertise." Holmes moved to the workbench, lifting the shortened embroidery scissors. "Mrs. Whitmore's murder was accomplished through mechanical ingenuity. You used her own embroidery scissors to cut the blue silk thread to precisely 18 inches, the perfect length for a ligature that would leave no conventional strangulation marks. A time delay mechanism using beeswax and silk thread secured the door bolt after the deed was done, creating your impossible locked room." Hartwell's composure began to crack as Holmes continued his methodical exposition. "The stopped clocks were your masterpiece of misdirection. You prepared each timepiece with carefully placed deposits of beeswax mixed with graphite, creating friction points that would arrest the mechanisms at precisely 23 minutes past 2, the same technique you employed on Sir Reginald's drawing-room clock during Whitmore's visit, establishing the precise timing of your alibi. But the true revelation," Holmes said, opening the adoption file, "lies in your connection to the child Mrs. Whitmore sought to adopt. Young Emma Hartwell, age 8, bears your distinctive features in these photographs. She is your daughter, born of an illicit relationship years ago and placed with the Ladies' Benevolent Society when you could not acknowledge her without destroying your carefully constructed professional reputation." The truth struck like a live, physical blow. Hartwell's mask of professional dignity crumbled, revealing the desperate man beneath. "She would have ruined everything," he whispered, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. 15 years of building a respectable practice, of escaping the mistakes of youth. One sentimental gesture toward a child who means nothing to me, and it would all crumble into scandal and disgrace. "Mrs. Whitmore recognized your daughter during her adoption interview." Holmes pressed relentlessly. "Her joy that morning came not just from the inheritance, but from the prospect of giving a loving home to a child she somehow connected to her past. You realized she would eventually discover your identity as the father, exposing both your abandonment of the child and the professional deceptions that followed. At that moment, Lestrade and his constables burst through the workshop door, their presence filling the confined space with official authority. Hartwell reached for something within his coat, but Holmes was faster, his walking stick striking the man's wrist with surgical precision. A small vial shattered against the floor, releasing the sharp scent of prussic acid into the workshop's atmosphere. "The same poison you intended for young Timothy," Holmes observed grimly. "And doubtless for anyone else who threatened to expose your secrets. But your mechanical precision betrayed you at every turn, the beeswax traces, the metallic filings, the surgical knowledge required to create your delayed action murder method." As Lestrade secured the prisoner, Hartwell's facade finally collapsed completely. "She was weak and sentimental," he snarled, his cultured voice now revealing its underlying viciousness. "Clinging to notions of maternal love for a child I gladly abandoned. The inheritance was convenient misdirection. But my real fear was exposure of the child, of my past, of the carefully constructed lies that built my current life." Holmes regarded him with cold distaste. "You orchestrated an elaborate deception using the very mechanisms of time itself, yet you failed to understand that even the most precisely wound clock cannot escape the inexorable march toward justice. Your daughter will find the loving home you denied her, while you face the consequences of valuing reputation over human life." As the constables led Hartwell away through the fog-wrapped streets, the workshop's timepieces resumed their gentle symphony, marking the passage of moments toward a justice long delayed but finally achieved. The case of the clockmaker's wife had revealed not just the mechanics of murder, but the tragic cost of a man who chose deception over truth, abandonment over responsibility, and ultimately, death over the simple acknowledgement of love. The morning following Hartwell's arrest brought a thin wash of pewter light through the workshop windows, illuminating the restored timepieces that now ticked in gentle harmony, their synchronized rhythm creating a memorial symphony for Adelaide Whitmore. Holmes stood among the mechanical chorus with uncharacteristic solemnity, his keen eyes surveying the scene where elaborate deception had finally yielded to methodical truth. Lestrade arrived bearing news from Scotland Yard that completed our understanding of the murderer's meticulous preparations. "The search of Hartwell's Marylebone surgery has revealed the full extent of his mechanical genius," Lestrade announced, consulting his notebook with obvious satisfaction. A locked cellar contained precision lathes, jeweler's tools, stocks of beeswax scored with channels, blue silk thread matching missus, Whitmore's embroidery, and an array of pulleys, catches, and timing mechanisms that would rival any clockmaker's workshop. We also discovered drafts of forged correspondence, including the note that lured young Timothy to his near-fatal encounter. Holmes nodded grimly, then began his methodical exposition of the crime's technical elements. Hartwell's murder method combined surgical precision with mechanical ingenuity. He shortened missus Whitmore's embroidery scissors ribbon to create the perfect length for a silk ligature backed with softened leather to distribute pressure without leaving conventional strangulation marks. The device was concealed beneath her usual workbench position, connected to a pulley system hidden within the bench's lower compartment. A time delay mechanism, using beeswax pellets and scored candles, released a weighted trigger at the predetermined moment, tightening the loop from behind as she bent over her needlework. Cornelius Whitmore entered as Holmes continued his explanation, the clockmaker's grief now tempered with grim understanding of his wife's final moments. The stopped timepieces were Hartwell's masterpiece of misdirection, Holmes continued. Each clock had been prepared during his visits with microscopic deposits of beeswax mixed with graphite at calculated friction points, designed to arrest all mechanisms simultaneously at 23 minutes past 2. He even doctored Sir Reginald's drawing-room clock during an earlier medical consultation, ensuring you would be present to witness and repair the coincidental malfunction that strengthened your alibi. Timothy Marsh arrived bearing a wooden box containing missus Whitmore's completed embroidery, his throat still marked by Hartwell's attempted silencing, but his spirits lifted by news of the murderer's capture. The young apprentice's hands trembled, slightly as he displayed the finished forget-me-nots, their blue silk threads rendered in the precise shade that had ultimately betrayed their creator's killer. "She finished them the morning she died," Timothy explained, his voice hoarse but reverent. "Said they would remind people that love endures even when memory fails. The church ladies want to display them as a memorial at the Christmas bazaar." Holmes examined the delicate needlework with his magnifying glass, noting the extraordinary precision of each stitch. "Your wife possessed remarkable skill, Mr. Whitmore. These flowers will serve as fitting remembrance of a woman whose capacity for love threatened a man who had forgotten how to feel it." Miss Prouse from the Ladies' Benevolent Society arrived with news that brought the first genuine smile to Whitmore's grieving features. "Young Emma has been placed with the Weatherby family of Hampstead," she announced with quiet satisfaction. "A childless couple who have longed for a daughter. The little girl carries with her a pressed sprig of forget-me-not and a letter explaining that a kind lady named Adelaide had hoped to give her a loving home." As we prepared to depart the workshop, Holmes paused beside the great regulator, its pendulum swinging with unwavering rhythm. "Time," he observed thoughtfully, "grants the same hours to saint and sinner alike, yet reveals character through how those precious moments are spent." Hartwell used his time constructing elaborate deceptions, while Adelaide Whitmore spent hers creating beauty and planning acts of love. The fog had begun to lift as our hansom carried us back toward Baker Street, revealing glimpses of London's familiar architecture emerging from the grey shroud like memories surfacing from darkness. Holmes maintained contemplative silence during our journey, his aquiline profile occasionally illuminated by pale sunlight that seemed to promise clearer days ahead. "Watson," he said, finally, as we approached our familiar door, "this case has demonstrated that even the most sophisticated mechanical deception cannot ultimately conceal the human heart's true nature." Hartwell's clockwork precision betrayed him at every turn, for time itself became the instrument of justice, exposing the truth he had worked so desperately to hide. "Mrs. Hudson greeted us with tea and the evening newspapers, their headlines proclaiming the resolution of what journalists had dubbed the Clockwork murder. But Holmes set aside these sensational accounts, his attention already turning toward the next challenge that awaited us in the endless catalogue of human folly and criminal ingenuity that was Victorian London. The morning light filtered through the clearing fog as Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The case of the clockmaker's wife finally resolved with the mechanical precision that had characterized both its execution and its solution. Our sitting room welcomed us with familiar warmth, the fire crackling in the grate, while the gentle ticking of our mantelpiece clock provided a soothing counterpoint to the silence that had surrounded those frozen timepieces in Whitmore's workshop. Holmes settled into his chair with that particular satisfaction he reserved for cases where every element had fallen into place with mathematical certainty. "Watson," he began, lighting his pipe with deliberate ceremony, "this affair has demonstrated the curious paradox of mechanical genius applied to moral bankruptcy. Hartwell possessed the technical skill to orchestrate murder with clockwork precision, yet he fundamentally misunderstood the very human emotions that drove him to such desperate measures." The Morning Post brought news that completed our understanding of the case's aftermath. Timothy Marsh had recovered fully from his ordeal and returned to the workshop, where Cornelius Whitmore had offered him a partnership in recognition of his loyalty during the darkest hours. The young man's engagement to Sarah Fletcher would proceed as planned, their spring wedding representing hope emerging from tragedy. Most significantly, little Emma had settled beautifully with the Weatherby family of Hampstead, carrying with her a pressed sprig of forget-me-not and the knowledge that a kind lady named Adelaide had planned to love her. The technical elements, Holmes continued, formed an almost perfect mechanism of deception. Hartwell used Mrs. Whitmore's own embroidery scissors, shortened by precisely 18 inches of ribbon, to create a silk ligature backed with softened leather. A pulley system concealed beneath her workbench provided the necessary force, activated by a time delay mechanism using beeswax pellets and scored candles. The simultaneous stopping of every timepiece was achieved through microscopic deposits of beeswax mixed with graphite at calculated friction points, creating the illusion of supernatural intervention when the truth was merely mechanical precision. I marveled at the intricate planning required for such elaborate deception. Yet for all his mechanical genius, he failed to account for the human element. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. His fear of exposure consumed all rational thought. Had he simply acknowledged his daughter and provided for her welfare, no scandal would have emerged. Instead, his shame transformed into murderous calculation, destroying an innocent woman whose only crime was the desire to offer love to an abandoned child. At that moment, Cornelius Whitmore arrived bearing a small package wrapped in brown paper. With trembling hands, he revealed a delicate mantel clock whose enamel dial was encircled by hand-painted forget-me-nots. "A memorial," he said simply, placing it upon our mantel beside our own timepiece. "It shall remain unwound, marking not the passage of time, but the permanence of love." Holmes received the Twares gift with uncharacteristic gentleness, understanding that some moments transcend the mechanical measurement of hours and minutes. "Your wife's final act of intended kindness found its completion despite those who would have prevented it," he observed softly. "Little Emma will grow, surrounded by love, carrying Adelaide's memory in the forget-me-nots that will bloom each spring in her new garden." As Whitmore departed, Holmes moved to examine the memorial clock with his magnifying glass, noting the exquisite craftsmanship that spoke of hours spent in patient devotion. "The true tragedy, Watson, lies not in Hartwell's technical brilliance, but in his fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. He believed that connections could be severed as precisely as clock springs, that time itself could be stopped to prevent the revelation of truth." The afternoon brought a telegram announcing a curious case from Yorkshire involving a missing sapphire and coded messages, promising new challenges for Holmes's remarkable faculties. As he reached for his coat and deerstalker hat, the memorial clock caught the light, its motionless hands serving as a permanent reminder that some things transcend the mechanical measurement of time. "The game, Watson," Holmes said with that familiar gleam in his eye, "is always afoot. But today we have learned that even the most precisely calculated evil cannot ultimately triumph over the simple human capacity for love and the determination to see justice served."